Everyone, and welcome to this an extra committee of the Committee for Communities. We're live to the public now, and I welcome you all to the meeting. Members, I'll just now advise you who's in the room and who's attending via Starleaf. So in the room there's myself, Kelly Armstrong, the Deputy Chair, and Andy Allen, and just coming through the door is Anya Murphy. And attending via Starleaf is Mark Durkin, our Chair, Paula Bradley and Stephen Dunn. So good morning. We may have others attend and we'll pick those up when they arrive. Members, the meeting today is solely to take evidence on the Private Tenancies Bill. No other matters will be discussed. I'd like to remind members of the requirement to declare any interest they may have in relation to items under discussion today. And we'll just start off with apologies. No apologies so far. Members, are you aware of any apologies for today's meeting? No. Okay. We want to move swiftly on then to agenda item 2, which is housing rights briefing on the Private Tenancies Bill. Members, the briefing paper is at page 6 of your pack, and I'd like to welcome Kate McCauley, Kerry Logan and Faith Westwood to our meeting. Thank you very much, folks, for coming along. Can I maybe bring all into the spot?
Can I declare an interest before we get underway as a private sector landlord, please?
Of course, Andy. Apologies. Yes, we'll certainly get that. Thank you for that. So thank you very much to all those who have come along from Housing Rights. And Kate, Kerry and Faith, can you start your presentation, please?
Many thanks to the committee for the opportunity to give evidence this morning. My name is Kerry Logan. I'm the Policy Coordinator at Housing Rights, and I'm joined by my colleagues Faith Westwood, who's our Practitioner Support Officer, and Kate McCauley, our Head of Policy and Development. As members will be aware, Housing Rights is an independent housing advice charity working to tackle homelessness and poor housing in Northern Ireland. A disproportionate number of the people who contact us for advice live in the private rented sector, and the experience of those clients, many of whom are on low incomes, is that within the private rented sector, a subsector exists which is characterised by poor standards, insecurity of tenure, and problems with affordability. We therefore strongly welcome the Private Tenancies Bill as the first in a series of legislative reforms to address these issues. In the interest of keeping within time, I'll focus my opening remarks on 4 of the clauses in the bill, and we will of course be happy to answer members' questions both on these and on the remaining clauses. Given its significance for our clients, I'd like to begin with clause 11. We support the extended notice period required by landlords provided in this clause. However, we believe that the impact of this change would be greater if the notice to quit period required were extended to 12 weeks instead of 8. In our clients' experience, it's increasingly difficult for low-income private renters to access suitable new tenancies, for example, due to affordability issues, guarantor requirements, and the ongoing discrimination of people in receipt of benefits. Indeed, many of our clients have struggled to access suitable new homes even with the 12 weeks notice afforded under the emergency coronavirus provisions. Furthermore, given that the emergency provisions and that 12-week notice period has been extended until May 2022, we believe there would be significant value in not mixing the messaging, as landlords and tenants have been made aware of the fact that that extended notice period is required, and so we believe it would be a benefit not to mix that messaging in introducing a different time frame in subsequent legislation. We'd also like to highlight to members our concern that Clause 11 does not provide any extra protection for tenancies which are under 12 months, despite the fact that tenants in these circumstances face all of the same challenges when it comes to finding a new home. In our view, it would be preferable for all private tenants to be given 12 weeks notice to quit. However, we accept the principles of tenancy law provide extra protection for tenancies of longer than 1 year, and it therefore may be appropriate for members to consider, for example, a notice period which is longer than the 4 weeks, but less than the notice period required for tenancies of over a year. And just as a final note on Clause 11, in order to ensure its impact is maximised, we recommend that the extended notice period is reflected in the homelessness legislation, namely the Housing NI Order 1988, in terms of the period during which a person is deemed to be threatened with homelessness. Secondly, briefly at clause 3, which concerns the requirement for tenants to be provided with a receipt for rent payments which are made in cash. In our experience, tenants can also be required to pay other fees in cash, and we therefore recommend that this requirement is extended to all cash payments made in relation to the tenancy, and indeed that the receipt should detail the purpose of the payment. It's our view that this would help assist tenants wishing to reclaim unlawful letting fees and ensure clarity in cases where payments are made to cover arrears, for example, in addition to rent payments. Thirdly, with regard to the proposal under clause 4 to limit tenancy deposits to the equivalent of 1 month's rent, we welcome this clause as an important first step in addressing some of the affordability issues faced by private renters. However, we believe that it is important that the bill also limits the amount of rent in advance which can be charged, again to 1 month. In our experience, the charging of multiple months' rent in advance can be another barrier when it comes to low-income private renters accessing new tenancies, and we're concerned that it would become a more and more common practice given this limit on deposits and indeed the extended notice to quit period. Finally, to look briefly at clause 7, we support the intention to include a measure within the bill to address the growing affordability issues faced by private renters. However, initial findings about the impact of similar provisions in Scotland, which also limit the frequency of rent increases to once in every 12-month period, indicate that this may have actually had the perverse effect of some landlords increasing rents more frequently than they previously would have. Furthermore, in our experience, the amount of a rent increase is likely to be at least as much of an issue as the frequency of the increase. We are therefore recommending that Article 5C, as proposed in Clause 7, is replaced with an article enabling the Department to introduce subsequent regulations to restrict the frequency of rent increases, as well as a mechanism to challenge unfair increases if it is deemed that these measures would address and not unintentionally exacerbate affordability issues. Many thanks again for inviting us to brief the committee this morning, and we would welcome the opportunity to answer any questions members have.
Thank you very much, Kerry. That was very useful for us, and thank you for going through the clauses. Before I open up the floor to the other members, can I just take you back? You had mentioned in your paper about clause 1, you proposed that tenants and representatives of tenants should be involved in determining the form and information in the notice of tenancy terms. Do you have any proposals on the best way to secure that involvement?
I'll maybe let Faith speak to that.
Yeah, well, I suppose with all things, consultation is useful in trying to engage tenants. I know that you're going to be hearing evidence later on today from the tenant board and how engaged they are, and they want to give their input as well. And I think that's probably a really key way of engaging with stakeholders and especially tenants and trying to get their feedback on what should be provided.
Could I just add, Chair, that obviously Housing Rights supports Renters' Voice, and I know you're going to hear from them next, so I in no way wanted to steal their thunder in terms of their views about the most effective ways to involve tenants. I would say from our experience as an organisation which has a history of supporting tenants to be involved in issues or in policy and legislation, I can't underestimate the importance of having effective independent policy support to assist tenants to be able to comb through what exactly these pieces of legislation actually mean, what the tenancy terms would mean and what the impact of those would be in order to assist them to make their fullest possible, to make their views known in the most comprehensive way possible. So I think that's been our experience of supporting tenants, but I think Renters' Voice will probably have quite a lot to say about that issue particularly.
And we're looking forward to hearing from them very shortly. Just finally, before I open the floor, in relation to clause 13, your paper states that time limits should be included regarding the date provisions that when this will come into operation. Have you any suggestions as to the time limit?
We appreciate that time will be needed in order for stakeholders, both tenants, landlords and other stakeholders, to be made aware of the rights and responsibilities that will come in with the introduction of this bill. In terms of the time limit for individual clauses, I imagine that would need to be determined by the department as to when that would be realistic and reasonable. But in terms of actually having those time limits prescribed, we believe that it would be important, obviously, that the clauses come into force and the rights under them come into force as soon as possible, but that people are made aware of how long that limit will be. Sorry, I can't speak to the exact limits for each of the clauses, but by making people aware, it not only means that there's clarity for stakeholders as to when they need to have the various provisions in place, for example, for landlords, ensuring that their tenancies meet all of the requirements under the bill, and for tenants to know when those rights will come into force, but also to ensure that the rights that will be provided under the bill and the welcome strengthening of the regulation of the private rented sector will come into place as soon as possible.
If I could just add that we appreciate, as Kerry mentioned, that for some of these clauses there will be some preparatory work that needs to be taken place, and we would urge the committee to ensure that the department commit to undertaking robust information and training, even where necessary, with stakeholders, to make sure that all stakeholders, and not just landlords and tenants, but also environmental health advice, there's a whole body of work involved, and that was one of the key things actually that came out of a seminar that we held with colleagues in Scotland and Wales, talking about the impact of similar legislation in their areas, and they said there needs to be comprehensive work undertaken with all stakeholders involved in the private rented sector to make sure that everyone understands the legislation that's coming into place in order to give it greatest effect on the ground.
Okay, so in this legislation, for instance, under Clause 13, there's a number of sections that will come into effect once it receives royal assent. The others won't. So what you're saying is, say for instance, if the department or perhaps the committee has an amendment to that says that the other schedules or the other sections would come in within 6 months, we would need to consider the fact that it may take a year or 2 years after that before, say for instance, a landlord can bring their home into line with whatever the regulations are saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And also thinking about what support there is for landlords and tenants, for example, for landlords to ensure that their home will meet energy efficiency standards, that it will, there's quite a lot of preparatory work involved in that. But I think with all of this, as soon as it's practical, and ensuring that information piece happens and that the support which is necessary, which may be practical, which may be about information and maybe about assistance, is there immediately, or to get this off the ground as quickly as possible, because these changes are long overdue.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to open the floor to the rest of the members. Anybody who's on Starleaf, if you want to ask a question, if you could raise your hand so I know if you're looking in. I'm looking around the room. Anybody here want to ask Housing Rights any further clarification questions? Paul?
Yeah, just a very quick one. I've read your paper, so thank you very much for that. Can I ask, just on that point you raised there about guidance going out and being shared, and training, dare I say, for all the bodies that would be involved, organisations that would be involved, including environmental health, do you think that the department should go as far as putting in a clause to this bill that speaks of that training and guidance? And make it a statutory requirement?
I think it should. I think it could usefully be explored. I'm not sure that it's necessarily something that would be essential. We've seen in other areas, for example, around HMO legislation, there's a requirement there that landlords are able to access support, and training and information. I suppose as a housing advice agency, Housing Rights, we are funded to provide information to the public and to practitioners, which would include environmental health, which would include other advice agencies. So we do a lot of work in that area, and we'll obviously be gearing up to ensure that the information around the private tenancies bill is communicated out there. I suppose one of the point that I'm maybe trying to make is, that one of the key things that came from our colleagues in Scotland and Wales was that the normal routes of providing information aren't necessarily sufficient. So it is incumbent upon the department and other stakeholders to ensure that an extra effort is made to really ensure that this information is out there. I suppose I'm thinking of a recent example where I was relayed information about a client who had been advised who had been issued a notice to quit, and their landlord had given them a 4-week notice to quit, and they had said, oh, I think I'm entitled to a 12-week notice to quit under the emergency legislation, and quite a lot of work had been done around communicating the information around the 12-week notice to quit included in the emergency legislation, and the landlord was actually an environmental health officer, and they weren't aware that the 12-week notice to quit was in place. So even people who are very in tune with what's going on in the private rented sector can sometimes miss key pieces of information. And if we are asking all these stakeholders to ensure that this legislation is given effect on the ground, I think we need to be ensuring that we provide support and information to them to do so. So to answer your question, should it be made a statutory requirement? I don't think there would be. I'd be reticent to say it should be made a statutory requirement without first exploring. I suppose for me, it seems quite an easy win. It seems something that should be done quite easily, and certainly Housing Rights and other agencies could take that piece of work and complete it quite readily. Without the need for placing a statutory requirement in the legislation. However, we're very open to exploring it.
Would it be then in order, if we didn't have statutory requirement to produce or provide training and guidance, should it be a requirement in the legislation that we would hold the department to a review of this legislation over a period of time? And if so, what period of time would you suggest that should be?
I don't want to give you half an answer now, so perhaps we can come back to you. I think it's good practice to review legislation as we move forward on a sort of continual basis. And I know, for example, that when the HMO legislation was put in place, the department undertook to carry out a review of it. And I'm very aware that the department have maintained that this is the first in a series of pieces of legislation, so I would anticipate that there'll be ongoing work with stakeholders and those involved in the sector to quantify the experience of this legislation as it's rolled out.
Okay, just before I pass the mic, Chair, I want to declare an interest as being an owner of a rented property. Should have done it at the start, but I was late, but I've done it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Andy?
Thanks, Chair. I'm just curious in relation to your Clause 7 suggestion in relation to rent increases and a mechanism to challenge unfair increases. Have you any more information as to what that mechanism might be?
Yes, well, I suppose when we looked at other jurisdictions and the experience there in both the Republic of Ireland and in Scotland, for example, there is a mechanism whereby landlords or tenants can refer to a third party. Now, in Scotland, it's a rent assessment panel, and in the Republic of Ireland, it's the Residential Tenancy Board, where there's an adjudication system which runs alongside their mediation service. And I think what we've seen in Scotland, the research that we referred to, which kind of said, there's some emerging evidence which shows that the impact of the provision to limit the frequency of rent increases has actually had a perverse impact. That research also showed that tenants weren't accessing the adjudication process or the process to have their what they perhaps would view as an unfair rent increase challenged in the same way that we may have anticipated that they would have access that system. So I think we'd be very keen to unpack and better understand the reasons why tenants haven't engaged with that before we move forward in Northern Ireland with a similar proposal. And I suppose that piece of research is due to complete in Scotland in 2023, which is one of the reasons why we have proposed that in Northern Ireland we insert an enabling clause which would allow the department to bring forward regulations to limit both the frequency of rent increases and the amount of the rent increase, and also to insert a mechanism to challenge what may be perceived as unfair rent increases as well. So in Scotland, for example, you can challenge what you may view to be an unfair rent increase, and the rent officer has the power to set the rent at the market rate. So you know, sometimes that can work in favour of the landlord, sometimes that can work in favour of the tenant. But I suppose, in our view, putting forward a mechanism which only looks at limiting the frequency of rent increase, or only looks at limiting the amount of a rent increase, without also inserting a mechanism which would allow a mechanism to address or to challenge or to adjudicate on the fairness of the rent increase in the first place, perhaps is incomplete.
No, absolutely, I appreciate that. Thanks for the overview.
Thank you very much. Members, anyone else indicating? Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I came in a wee bit late to thank Housing Rights for their submission here. It's very informative, and certainly I think we as a committee will be leaning heavily on it as we consider the legislation in front of us, as I'm sure the department have in their crafting of the legislation as well. We've gone through that clause by clause, and certainly I would agree with some of the points made by the team there on how some of the clauses could or should be strengthened. But is there anything else that's not in any of these clauses? Maybe that Housing Rights as an organisation feel that this bill presents an opportunity to get on and then legislation to use this bill as a vehicle for?
In terms of the proposed amendments that we've made in relation to each of the clauses, we understand that given the short time left in this political mandate, that this legislation won't be able to cover the myriad of issues that exist in the private rented sector, and that's why we're welcoming it as a first step, and an important first step. And in terms of the rights that are provided under this legislation, we think it's really important that it gets through in this mandate, and that people living in the private rented sector can rely on that added protection as soon as possible. However, 100% there's much more that needs to be done, and I know whenever the Minister was introducing the legislation, she was explaining that in the next mandate it would be the hope of the department that further legislation would be implemented, for example around letting fees, letting agent regulations, and landlord licensing is another area in which we would really think it's really important that legislation is brought forward as soon as possible. However, we do recognise that given the limited time period in this mandate, that it won't be possible to cover all of those things within the scope of this bill.
I think if I could just add to what Kerry said there, I think we've tried to take a very pragmatic approach to this legislation. There are obviously areas where we would like to see enhanced protection. You know, standards is obviously a huge area, and there are some welcome improvements here, but there are fundamental issues that need to be addressed in the private rented sector in relation to standards. I think as you go through our evidence, you'll see that in places we have suggested areas where we think the legislation could easily be improved. So, for example, in relation to rent receipts, the provision around rent receipts, we've said this could apply to all cash payments and could cover a number of different areas. In relation to deposit, limits on deposit, we've also talked about limits on rent in advance. So there are a number of different areas where we feel that in taking a pragmatic approach, you can maximise the impact of this legislation without unpicking it to an extent that it perhaps wouldn't move through the assembly process in the essential way that it's required.
No, but I think that's fair enough. It does secure will and should secure improvements in the private rented sector, much needed. And well, I'd fully concur that it's important that we don't make this overly cumbersome or complicated or jeopardise its passage through the Assembly. That we, like, it's a first step, but I think it's important we make that as big and progressive a step as possible. I know that the Department of Justice, they hope that in the next mandate there'll be further legislation. We genuinely don't know when the next step will be. We have a habit of hobbling along in this place, so I think it is vitally important that we as a committee adopt a similarly pragmatic approach, but an ambitious one as well, to secure what's best for people here.
Thank you very much, Mark. I don't see any other member indicating at this stage on Starleaf or in the room, so I appreciate we're under a wee bit of time pressure today, but absolutely thank you so much, guys, for your submission. It is extremely helpful, and I'm sure if you have anything further you can send on into the committee, and we may ask other questions at a later stage, and I hope that we can do that with you. But for now, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Members, apologies if it feels like I'm rushing you today. I just wanted to say we've just had confirmation apologies from Ciara this morning, and also to confirm Mark is in the room, not on Starleaf. Nice to see you, Mark.
My first committee coffee.
Members, I want to move you quickly on to agenda item 3. This is the briefing paper is at page 37 of your pack, and we will be welcoming Renters' Voice briefing on the Private Tenancies Bill. Today we have Claire Madison, Jenny Miller and Glenn Willis. Folks, you are very, very welcome, and we absolutely are so thankful that you can join us today to help us with our deliberations on this bill. We have a short period of time with yourself, so I'll not hold you back. Claire, Jenny, Glenn, if you want to give us a quick presentation, and then we'll get to questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. On behalf of the entire Renters' Voice groups, I would extend our thanks to the committee for this invitation to present our evidence this morning and in the written documents previously submitted. I'm Jenny Miller. I'm a member of Renters' Voice. Our other representatives this morning are Glenn Wills and Claire Madison, who's our coordinator. We represent a core group of private tenants who meet regularly to lead activities and respond to issues affecting tenants within the private rental sector. For example, we conducted a survey in October 2020 regarding people's long-term experience of renting in Northern Ireland, as well as the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the results from this form actually many of our recommendations for this bill. We welcome this bill, and we view it as a very workable starting point when it comes to providing people with warm, safe, secure home with improved relationships between landlord and tenant. In particular, we welcome the bill and review it. We welcome that the bill contains some first steps regarding affordability of rent and deposits, property standards, and increased security for tenants. Our October 2020 survey flagged some really significant issues. For example, with regards to affordability, 58% of respondents cited difficulty in finding affordable properties. This, currently with the increase of costs of food, fuel and property prices, alongside the £20 per week cut in universal credit, will further compound this problem, and we expect this percentage to rise even more during the next year. We would, however, like to flag that 6 of the top 10 changes that private tenants would like to see, according to our October survey, are actually not addressed in the bill, including increased checks on landlords when they register, increased legal fitness standards for rental properties, and a scheme to help people with tenancy deposits, nor are letting agent fees. Much more is needed to make the private rented sector truly fit for purpose. To speak only of fitness standards and repairs, members of our group have lived with black mould, leaks, broken heating systems, and indeed our survey also supports the lived evidence within the group, with 3 of the top answers relating to repairs and poor treatment by landlords. Specific to some of the clauses that are included in the bill, we welcome the clauses regarding tenants being given more notice on matters, but we feel that more steps need to be considered, including tenant information packs, and working with tenants and landlords on how to increase awareness of rights and responsibility, and to this end we have suggested a co-design process. We welcome the limit on tenancy deposit to no more than 1 month's rent, and we feel it's also necessary to limit the rent in advance. Most of our members have experienced difficulty in raising what amounts to a large sum of money for a deposit on a first month's rent, and face hardships caused by these requirements. When added to other movement costs, this brings incredible stress. Regarding restricting rent increases to a maximum of once every 12 months, we welcome the intention behind this clause, but we feel it's necessary to look stronger and more effective mechanisms to limit the amount by which the rent can be raised. Regarding the security of tenure, a longer notice to quit period of 6 months is something we've been campaigning for throughout 2021, and we would encourage the committee to read our gathered information, which we have included in our full written evidence. We've also talked in our evidence about the precarity that is the lack of security that this lack of security can bring, and the impact that we've experienced on our health and mental well-being as a result. Excuse me. And current insecurity being the root of many further issues for renters. For example, not being able to ask for repairs or to stick up for our rights, feeling that we can just be asked to leave. Increasing tenant security of tenure will lead to improvements in every area of life: physical health, mental health, productivity, and capacity to thrive. It will reduce instances of homelessness, lessen the burden on other services, and it will most certainly save lives. 6 months' notice is not an unreasonable ask, and would in fact still leave Northern Ireland behind the rate of progress in most jurisdictions across the UK and Ireland. For private tenants, this change cannot wait. There's lots more I could speak about this morning, and possibly well into the afternoon as well, but alas, and understandably we are under time constraints, and I do urge you to read our written submission. And again, on behalf of all Renters' Voice, I thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning, and just reiterate, these changes cannot wait. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was very useful, and the paper is very useful as well. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you a few questions first, and then I'll open it to the floor again. I'll just say to the members on Starleaf, anybody who wishes to speak, if you could raise your hand, and the same in the room, and I'll try and keep my eye out for the hand raisers. Just going back to your paper, members, just page 39 of your pack, which is on the paper, it's 3.2. Renters' Voice, you've raised top 10 changes that people said that they would like to see included in private renting. The paper states that at least 6 out of the top 10 changes that private tenants would like to see are not addressed in the bill. We know that there are a range of issues that need to be dealt with in the longer term, but do you feel the bill has missed the opportunity to deal with some of those further matters? And if so, what are those ones that you would like to highlight to us?
So as we've stated in our written address, overall we do welcome the bill, and we think that many of the issues are addressed to an extent. However, we feel that some areas lack substantive protection for tenants. For example, with regards to rental deposits, while limiting deposits to 1 month is a welcome change, failing at the same time to limit the amount of
Glenn, could I just stop you for a moment? Glenn, sorry, can I just stop you for a moment? We're not hearing you very clearly in the office here. Can we maybe bring Glenn up into the spotlight? That might be easier then. He's not appearing on the large screen, it's just Jenny. All right, okay.
Can he turn off his camera? Does that?
I wonder, we turn off Glenn's camera, or? Sorry, Glenn, we just want to make sure we can hear from you properly.
No problem.
Chair, it may be that the fact that the two are in the same room, maybe it looks like.
Yeah.
Jenny, are you muted?
Yeah. That's better.
Jenny should be muted now.
I think that's better now. Thank you, Glenn.
Hi, well, I think that the question was whether a chance has been missed to address some of the points. I think that we've stated quite clearly that reform can't wait, and also some of the clauses lack some of the substantive protections for tenants that are needed. For example, with regards to tenancy deposits, while tenancy deposits themselves are limited, rent in advance isn't limited. So it's not necessarily that a chance has been missed in the long term, but certainly within this package that is quite limited. So while that is welcome, our overall position is that the most important thing to stress is that further protections are needed eventually, and that the bill is extremely welcome, but it needs to be seen in the context of a wider reform package.
Just earlier there, Jenny mentioned letting agents' fees. If you could just expand on those, please.
I can come in for that one. We actually have 3 people in the same room, so I hope you can hear me.
We can.
So letting agent fees is an area that we feel very clearly needs to be legislated for, and we think there's a lot of agreement with politicians as well that needs to happen. We understand that there's blocks to that happening under the current legislation because more than one department is involved, for example. So we haven't concentrated in our response a lot on letting agent fees, except to say that it needs to happen. We've tried to focus, so we flagged up those changes that we would like to see, including those ones from our top 10 changes that people would like to see. But in our response, we've really tried to focus on, at the minute, trying to strengthen some of the areas, for example, notice to quit, which are already being looked at, and our position is that we really do feel that those need to be strengthened now. Like Jenny's saying, from a tenant's perspective, it can't wait. And we heard Mark Durkin previously saying as well that we just don't know when the next phase of reforms will happen. So that's another reason why we're saying that some of the clauses need to be strengthened now. But we also appreciate that this bill can't cover everything that we would like to see happening, and that letting agent fees might be one of those areas.
Understand. Thank you so much. I'm going to open up to the floor now, so I don't hug you guys completely. I'm just looking around the room, and again, just remind those on Starleaf, if you want to come in, please raise your hand. Anyone in the room have questions for Renters' Voice? Mark.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the team from Renters' Voice. Again, I think it's a very useful submission. I'm glad that we sought it, because I think it was maybe yourself, Kelly, who made the point that they should be brought in and we should be hearing from them. Renters' Voice is a very important voice, perhaps the most important voice in this whole piece of legislation. In terms of the top 10, our asks, sorry, I've lost it here now on my computer. But like this is looking at, I suppose, restricting or controlling the frequency with which rent increases can happen. I've stated a position before, and I think it would be shared by others. I would also like to maybe see control on how much an increase can be. I don't know, have you guys got a view on that?
We feel quite strongly that is a reform that is needed. I think that we would also reiterate a point that I know that Housing Rights made this morning, which is that it's not exactly clear whether simply reducing the frequency with which the frequency at which rents can increase actually makes a positive influence, or a positive influence to the extent that it's needed. I think that we also have general concerns about affordability within the private rental sector. And so I think that that type of reform would be a sensible way to not only ensure affordability but also security of tenure, because it's a serious concern for tenants moving into a property that subsequently becomes unaffordable to them. So we think that it's a really key piece of reform that's needed.
It's something we've seen an awful lot of, I have to say, over the past while we've been working with or under the emergency 12-week notice to quit legislation. There are a huge number, I'd have to say, of constituent cases that I've dealt with where people are basically being evicted by or through affordability issues, where landlords are seeing the increase in property values and slapping on huge increases in terms of rent that haven't been matched by increases in local housing allowance, and it's putting people into debt and out of their homes. I think we really need to look at putting as many and as robust a set of protections in as possible.
Yeah, we've used the term shadow evictions in our evidence paper, which is the situation where a tenant's rent is increased and essentially means that they have no choice but to move out. So that's one of the reasons we've cited as well for a need for rent caps rather than just the yearly limit on rent increases.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Thanks, Chair.
Could I just ask on that point, private rent sector and housing benefit. So if a landlord increases the rent beyond housing benefit levels, is there any idea of the percentage increase given from your evidence from other renters? Is there a point after which that it becomes just impossible? So say, for instance, X percentage above housing benefit rates or X percentage of increase on a monthly. I know it's a hard one to say, but I'm just looking, is there any ideas or any thoughts that you have had on what percentage that you would like the limit on the amount of rent in advance, or sorry, the amount of rent to be increased by?
It's a good question, but it's a tricky one because of the specifics of it. It's something that we could ask again more specifically. I think Jenny might have wanted to come in on her own experience, though she might be able to speak from her own experience.
I was just wanting to make the point that when your rent increases, your housing benefit doesn't. It's static. There is the option to apply for discretionary payments, but they're very rarely made. So if you're already on a tight budget, your housing benefit doesn't even cover your rent to start with. If that increases even more, it puts a tenant in more of a precarious situation, and there is again the possibility of homelessness. Okay. Or just having to find a shelter, any shelter. That's another way for the landlords it's like a shadow eviction again.
Jenny, just so that we have it on record, can I just ask you then, housing benefit, in your experience, how often does housing benefit increase?
I have been on housing benefit for 6 years and have never had an increase.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I thought that.
Yeah.
I thought
the rent has increased, but the housing benefit hasn't.
Okay. No, it's just so we have that on record. No, thank you very much. I'm looking around the room. Just any other member? Andy, sorry, you want to come in?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for your presentation and the answers you provided so far. They've been helpful. Just curious in relation to two of your six, or the six of your top 10 asks or feedback from renters. In terms of the deposit scheme, I'd just like to sort of delve into that a bit more. I know it's not included within the legislation, but I think it's very important because it's something that I see all the time, individuals who are priced out of the private rental sector that they need to be able to access. Have you had any engagement with the department on that, and there's been any feedback regarding such a scheme?
Do you want me to come in? So we've certainly raised the issue with the department. We had a meeting earlier this year with some senior department officials, and we raised the findings of our survey, including those top 10 changes, and got a lot of information about what was going to be in the bill and what was going to be down the line. I would say that the deposit scheme is one of the ones that they didn't particularly concentrate on when we were speaking to them, and we we very much would support more conversations around a better deposit support scheme than exists currently. Again, I'm not sure if Jenny wants to add anything, because I know it's something that she's had personal experience of.
Yeah, sorry, my mouth temporarily went dry there, so I had to look at yourself. Yes, 6 years ago I was homeless, classed as homeless in a domestic violence refuge. Longest list ever for the housing executive, and I ended up decided I would take a private rental, but obviously having been homeless and the financial stress of that, I didn't have the deposit. And there was an organisation called Smart Move. I'm not sure, I think they've just lost a bit of funding recently, but what they did was they provided the deposit up front, and they dealt with the rental properties with the landlords that were happy to take new tenants. And once you were in situ in the house, you just added the deposits. It was a very low amount, I think it was £20 a month on top of my rent to then clear the deposit. Without that, I'm not entirely sure where we would end up. Certainly I would have still been in the hostel environment for a lot longer. Hostels and refuges, they're fantastic, they do fantastic work. After 14 months, you really need your own space, your children need your own space, you've got to get your life back. At the minute, the private rental sector just is not helpful in doing that. It just goes back again to lessening the burden on everyone, basically.
No, absolutely, and hopefully this legislation will go some way to curbing the deposits on the deposit amount, which will have a positive impact. I'm curious as well in relation to the increased checks on landlords when they register. Can you give us more detail on that, what that would entail?
I'll maybe come in on that one as well. It's one of the we asked about that because it was one of the proposals previously discussed when the previous consultation period happened to do with what should be in the reform legislation. So we asked quite specifically about some of those issues to see how tenants currently felt about them, and that we weren't surprised that came out the strongest, because our other findings from our surveys are that people have experienced issues with landlords and also with letting agents. So we weren't surprised that people went for an option that that looked like there would be increased checks on landlords. We think that statement on its own isn't enough. It needs to be fleshed out, and what's included more so in our evidence is a better registration scheme and ideally a licensing scheme for landlords. So a big theme in our evidence is the need for greater regulation in the sector, and we think that a licensing scheme could really help with that. And we've also pointed out in our evidence the disparity between the general private letting sector and the regulation there, and the case for HMOs as well. So I think we would take that point from our survey and expand on it a bit, and say that what we're really interested in is greater checks on landlords, and ideally a greater licensing scheme.
Okay, thanks very much. And finally, the last point in relation to dispute resolution, and you say there are more ways to resolve disputes between tenants and landlords. Is there any models that you would point to that work well in other jurisdictions?
We're getting some questions and some points. We've prepared less than some of our main points in our evidence. Perhaps because you've read our main evidence, so you're interested in the other aspects of it. We're aware of things like the mediation service that's currently happening, supported by Housing Rights, which we think is a good model, and we'd be interested in models from outside being looked at. But it's not something. One of our big challenges as a group is that there's always so much to talk about and so many issues in the private rented sector for us to talk about. So that isn't one of the points that we've come back to a lot and had a lot of time to really expand on the views of the group. But we think it's really important at the same time.
No, absolutely, and apologies, I did stray from the legislation to an extent, but I think they're important matters, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. This is an important conversation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Andy. Anyone else have hands raised at this stage? Folks, I maybe just ask one final question with you. In clause 3, where tenants should be provided with rent receipt for payment in cash, if a tenant complains about the landlord not providing a receipt, and now we've heard from Housing Rights that it's not just about rent receipt, it'd be any cash receipts, where currently would that complaint be shared with? And where would you like that shared with?
Well, the consensus that we have in the group is that tenants are currently unaware where they would complain, that it's like largely unregulated. I'm not sure even where tenants should complain. Mostly it seems to be through services like Housing Rights.
Okay.
In Northern Ireland.
Yeah. No, this is one of the issues that I have with the legislation, is it's not very clear exactly who would take on that responsibility. No, I just wanted to check that with you. Paul, sorry.
Just on the back of your very good question, Deputy Chair, can I ask, in your experience in your organisation, how prevalent or common is it that tenants would hand over cash without receiving any sort of proof of payment or receipt?
It's incredibly prevalent. You will find that some landlords and letting agencies, including one that I have just used in the last couple of years, they will only accept cash. If you try to get a receipt, you might as well ask for the moon on a stick. They might promise you might get it, but even if you get the receipt, even then it doesn't really stand up to much.
So that I'm clear exactly what you said. Did you say that there's some letting agents that only accept cash?
Yeah, especially for deposits and the first month's rent. I find most of them will accept bank transfer then for the subsequent rent, but especially that first month. I mean, I had a situation where I had to walk down the Ulmer Road with the guts of £1,000 in my handbag, absolutely petrified, to take into the agency. That was 2 years ago. I'm still waiting for the receipt. I think I'll be waiting until doomsday. But yeah, quite a few members in the group where their landlord just calls at the door every month and expects the cash payment there and then.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I think on that stark note, we now understand exactly why there needs to be a cash receipt provided in support for this legislation. Guys, I'm not seeing anybody else raising hands at this moment. All I can say at this time is your evidence has been extremely useful. It just goes to show exactly why it's important that people who are on the cold face, who are the renters, are very important to this legislation for the committee to hear from. We've asked you a few questions that you said you haven't got the answers to at this stage. You're very welcome to go away, have a think about that, and if you've any evidence further that you can provide to us, we'd be more than happy to receive. If you could get that to us as soon as possible, because obviously our time with the bill is a bit limited. If we're to scope out anything that may improve this bill, it would be very welcome. But for now, to each of you, thank you so much for your time. So Claire, Jenny and Glenn, very much appreciated today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Members, we're now moving on. Sorry, I am rushing you through this because I know Andy's going to have to go off now to prepare for today, but we're now agenda item 4, page 72 of your pack. We will be talking now to Justin Cartwright from the Chartered Institute of Housing, who's going to provide us with a briefing on the private tenancies bill. And I believe we have Justin with us, yeah? Justin, thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to go on ahead with your short briefing, and then you'll get to lovely questions from ourselves. Thank you.
Great, thanks Kelly, and good morning everyone. The Chartered Institute of Housing is the professional body for people working in housing. As an education charity, we run a qualification for private landlords and letting agents that several hundred learners in Northern Ireland have undertaken. It's our belief that knowledge has a very important part to play in professional conduct. We want to declare from the outset that we've recently completed some commercial research for the department on a further extension to notice to quit periods. That would be enabled by clause 11 of this bill, so we haven't submitted evidence on that to avoid either a conflict of interest or influencing the forthcoming consultation on that. On the other clauses, it's our view that this is a bill that represents much needed change. against the backdrop of a growing private rented sector. Getting straight to it, clauses 1 and 2 would enable the department to require the provision of written information, which would help to stop the practice of verbal agreements, and that's to be welcomed. We believe good practice in housing management includes things like written tenancy agreements and tenant information packs. And we think those documents help to inform tenants and landlords of their responsibilities, which helps to reduce those differences that leads to disputes. So something on condensation and mould growth, for example, would be useful, which is a poorly understood area in the PRS. Similarly, we support Clause 3, providing tenants with a receipt when paying in cash. There should be written evidence of all payments, and we'd urge that, like a lot of consumer transactions, though, that the receipt be provided when the money is exchanged, whereas the current clause allows it to take place afterwards. And we'd also recommend a requirement for a receipt for other allowable fees as well that can be accrued. Moving on to the deposit requirements under Clause 4, we agree with a cap on deposits. We think that will help access and affordability for tenants. We would recommend that the maximum deposit be raised slightly from 1 month to 5 weeks. The reason for that, in practice, most tenancies are and will continue to be ended with 4 weeks notice, because most tenancies are ended by the tenant, about 2/3 of them. And that's commensurate with a month's deposit. But once you start increasing notice periods for landlords, rent owed over the additional period of notice can then exceed the amount held in deposit. So if you have a case of serious rent arrears, for instance, that stores up the potential for protracted debt recovery action. So we think raising the maximum very slightly to 5 weeks would help to address that in part, while not introducing unreasonable affordability barriers for people renting privately. By way of example, 5 weeks is the maximum allowed in England and Wales, so it's been tested in those markets, many of which are much less affordable than those in Northern Ireland. Moving on, Clause 6, we support that to make it an ongoing offence to fail to protect a deposit and to give prescribed information. Most tenancies run longer than 6 months, and yet the current prosecution time bar on a deposit-related offence means that action can't be taken 6 months after the offence is first committed, and enforcement really is critical to ensure that in all cases the tenant's money is protected and all parties can avail of dispute resolution for deposits. Clause 7, we support restricting rent increases to once a year, given that addresses the frequency of price adjustments rather than their value, because rent control, on the other hand, would be a much more complicated issue. But Clause 7 proposals, I think what they will do is reassure tenants that their rent will remain the same for a period without the fear of any unexpected increases. When it comes to exemptions, we would urge caution when defining alterations to ensure that any rise in rent is for genuine alterations and not small alterations that might be used as a way around that particular requirement. Clauses 8 and 10 on fire, smoke and carbon monoxide and electrical safety, as the Grenfell tragedy warns, the importance of fire safety just can't be understated. So we support requiring private landlords to keep fire and carbon monoxide alarms in proper working order. I think it would be important that tenants know how to use those too, particularly carbon monoxide alarms. So there's a role there for information exchange too. Likewise, we support electrical safety checks. Most accidental fires in Northern Ireland are linked to electricity. An annual gas safety certificate is already required, so it makes sense to extend that to electrical safety. And we'd support 5 yearly safety checks of all electrical installations provided as part of the tenancy by a registered electrician, and 5 yearly in terms of the period. And finally, just on Clause 9, energy efficiency regulations. In the fight against climate change and fuel poverty, it's our view that tenants should live in warm, energy-efficient homes without the high running costs. So minimum energy efficiency standards will obviously play a role in that, but we must ensure, I think, that higher standards are actually achieved and we don't inadvertently encourage landlords to sell properties through financial disincentives. homes could be sold to owner-occupiers where there may be fewer trigger points again through which to improve standards. So it's just a comment that we think financial incentives will play an important role as well as minimum standards. We'd just like to thank the committee for the opportunity to give evidence, and we're happy to take any questions. And I'm joined by my colleague Heather Wilson, who's our policy manager in Northern Ireland.
Hi Heather, sorry, I was just going to introduce you formally. Lovely to see you this morning. Again, I'm just going to remind all members present with me or on Starleaf, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, make sure I see you. Justin and Heather, I'll maybe start off. Going back to your clause 7 comments, your paper states that the wording of this clause may allow for an abuse of rent raising if the bill fails to further define these circumstances. For instance, clause 7(4) may allow for a landlord to increase the rent for replacing a cracked kitchen tile and replace it with new laminate flooring under the guise of alterations. And we've just talked about there, the necessity to ensure that environmental standards, for instance, would be in place. Do you feel that this clause needs more work to ensure its intentions are properly met?
I think if I can, I'll start on that, Heather, and you can jump in. I think, so we've got, subparagraph 3 specifying that regulations will determine those circumstances. So it would really be, I suppose, to provide additional security. You may define alterations as part of this bill, because I suppose the risk is, with it being defined through forthcoming regulations, what will the definition of alterations be? So we just want to make sure that they're, for genuine alterations, perhaps those that, raise the capital value of the property, or there's some kind of, benchmark or substantial measurement on that, rather than just leaving it as alterations. And then you find it's a perverse incentive to use that as a way around the requirement.
I think that'll be important maybe for us as the committee to include in our report back. The other thing I wanted to ask you about then is in relation to clause 3, article 5(3)(b), your paper states, and you've said to us today, that like any consumer transactions, a receipt should be provided at the time that money is exchanged, not at any later date. Then do you think then that 5(3)(b) should be removed from the bill? That's the one where it states about reasonable period of time, if the receipt isn't available at that precise moment, that reasonably possibly afterwards. I think that should be taken out.
Will I go for that one, Justin?
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Yeah, I think we did, Kelly, we would agree with that being taken out, just because, like any consumer transaction, you or I would expect to receive a receipt upon paying for something in cash, and we felt that renters paying for rent or any other fee in cash shouldn't be treated any differently, or shouldn't have to wait for that. So I think from our point of view, we would support that being removed.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go then to members in the room or on Starleaf. Anyone indicating? Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Chair. Very interesting submission, so thank you very much for that. Can I ask, just on the point that Kelly raised around clause 3, do you think, and I'm tending to agree that 5(3)(b) should be removed, because I just don't think it's acceptable with any transaction of money that you wouldn't have proof of the exchange. It just seems bizarre that someone would be forced to leave themselves open like that. But can I ask, should there be within this bill the provision whereby a letting agent or landlord must allow choice of payment, so that it's up to the tenant to take up whatever method of payment they see fit, whether that be cash or bank exchange, but at least the letting agent should offer that choice, so that, well, what do you think of that? Would that be reasonable?
It's an interesting question. To be honest, it's probably not something that we've given an awful lot of thought to. Our kind of, finger on the pulse of the sector is that, cash payments are probably a dwindling thing. They still certainly happen, as you heard from Renter's voice. But certainly, my own experience as as a past private renter for many years, is that the expectation was always, that rent be paid by standing order, which, in effect gives you that record of payment without requiring the receipt. So I think this to us is more of a clause to, mop up that discrepancy when it comes to cash payments, to ensure that people actually have a written record of the exchange. In terms of the method of payment, we wouldn't have any substantive thoughts beyond that, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add, Linda?
No, it's something I probably need to explore just as we proceed throughout this. Can I ask just on the point about electrical testing? I suppose I'll need to declare an interest as an electrician, a qualified electrician by trade. Do you see also grounds, now I know that clause 10 only talks about the department making regulations concerning, so we're not really getting into detail, but just so we flag it up early, you cited about the electrical risks with regards to the creation of fire, but that will be as much to do with portable equipment as it will with the electrical installation. So when you say that you agree with the 5-year term for inspection, would that also include PAT testing? And if it does, then the onus should be then on the tenant, should it not? Because it's they that own the equipment that's going to be portably, that's portable and that will need to be and required to be tested also. That in itself might put a financial burden on the tenant, but there would also be a financial burden on the landlord if he was having to pay for inspections. So is that something that you've considered, and should it be also included, the PAT test, should that also be included within the regime of testing?
Again, it's a really good question. I don't know if you know the safety charity Electrical Safety First is a body that we've been, working in partnership around some of this stuff. So I'll defer to Heather in terms of if she has any observations around conversations with them on this. I mean, the position that we have is that, we think 5-yearly checks should be on appliances provided as part of the tenancy. But I mean, as you said, there's definitely additional risk around, portable equipment and equipment that the tenant owns as well. So it's a very good question, and you would think in terms of just in ease of process and making sure that you cover and reduce as many risks as possible, that you would just test the equipment that's in the house, as well as the stuff that's provided. I mean, if you're paying for the one visit, as you say, through a PAT test, I mean, a handful of additional items, would be cost effective and also reduce the risk. So it's certainly something to consider as part of the regulations. But Heather, did that come up specifically in our chats with Electrical Safety First?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think that the portable electrical items came up per se, but I guess it's kind of almost a personal kind of experience of myself. I remember being a student and PAT testing being included, and all your, even right down to your straighteners and your hairdryer was PAT tested, and the landlord had paid for that. Now we haven't give much thought to that at the minute, but it's certainly something we can go away and speak to the Electrical Safety First guys and come back to the committee on that.
You can imagine a scenario where a landlord is inspecting his own property, maybe even there to collect rent or whatever, and sees a radio or a pair of hair straighteners, something lying on the floor with a bad lead, or charged with carbon because of a fire risk, and then him or her asking the tenant to replace or remove them from their property, for fear of damage, and then there would be a dispute there. Well, I can't afford a new radio, or I can't afford a new pair of whatever, hair dryers you've alluded to, or something else. So there could be that dispute there, and I suppose that the landlord has a right to try and protect his or her own property in that regard. So again, there may be something in this.
I think so, and if you tie it to PAT testing, then you have clear recorded evidence there that a particular appliance has failed. So perhaps there's room for additional thought about what then happens as part of that kind of triggered failure event.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else raising hands? Justin, can I just ask? There's one that I would like clarification on. It's clause 11, where it's the validity notices, or validity requirements for notices to quit given by landlords, and then that continues on throughout the whole of clause 11. Can I just ask you, my concern is the notice to quit, whether it's a tenant or whether it's a landlord. So say, for instance, a landlord is given a tenant notice. Is it the date of the letter, or is the date that the tenant receives the letter? Because a landlord could sit on a letter for a fortnight, or a tenant could sit on a letter for a fortnight. What is the date that that applies from?
I should know the answer to this, but I have to say that I don't technically off the top of my head. I mean, the definition of a notice is that it's given in writing. So you would say that it would be no. I mean, I wouldn't want to give you a half incorrect answer on that. I mean, in practice, I think it would be when the tenant gets the notice.
It's something that I would just like to have clarified, and it may well be that we have to seek with the department to see what that legal issue is there, because my concern would be for those who are under 12 months tenancy, and if they're afforded 4 weeks and 2 of those weeks they don't even know, maybe they're away on holiday or whatever's happening, and they're served with notice to quit and they have 2 weeks to get out, it makes it extremely difficult, especially if that person has nowhere else to go and then all of a sudden they're presented with a homelessness situation. It's just something that we'll maybe ask the department to clarify on that. You've also said, just to finally come in with me, and if anybody else hasn't indicated, in clause 9 your paper states that you would urge the department to ensure that any adverse political or policy impacts from making private stock more energy efficient are mitigated at an early stage. Do you have any proposals as to how this can be mitigated for?
I mean, I think I suppose that this is a proposal that's come from, the departmental proposals for change that have been in the pipeline for some time. So I think, this is something that we've kind of flagged a few years ago with the hope and expectation that the climate conversation would be, further along than it is, and you would have, minimum standards established and also additional funding streams in place by now. That obviously hasn't happened, due to the ongoing impact of the Assembly collapse and obviously the big legislative backlog that you have there. So I mean that hasn't happened. I mean, I think in terms of where we are now, that's not a reason to not set minimum energy efficiency standards for private rented properties. I do think we need to move ahead with that in the context of the climate challenge. But in terms of what we can do in the meantime, I think behavioural things will have a major impact on the use of energy efficiency technologies. So again, I think exchange of information, making sure that tenants are involved in the conversation around this and know how to use any new technologies, because certainly in the social rented sector, where a lot of our members would be based, there's been, I suppose, horror stories in recent times where new measures have been installed and actually have to be retrospectively removed, because there wasn't support there, for instance, in the supply chain to maintain these new technologies. In some instances, tenants and residents didn't know how to use them and were using the equivalent of immersion heaters and things like that when say the heat pump wasn't working properly, which obviously makes their fuel bills skyrocket. So just, I think, early engagement, engagement with groups like, Renters Voice and supporting communities to the extent that this conversation extends into the social rented sector as well. But yeah, we think probably exchange of information would be pretty important stuff from an early stage.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Mark at this stage.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Justin and Heather. Just one wee issue there. Justin was talking about the importance of engagement with groups, and they touched on it early in the paper here, the importance of communication. While this legislation undoubtedly proposes to do some good, beneficial things, any legislation is only as good as those enforcing it or applying it. So there's going to be a vital role here for landlords. We do know the vast majority of landlords are responsible. There are some rogues out there, without a doubt, but it's how we communicate these changes, these improvements, these new protections to landlords, who will ultimately then be responsible for communicating them to their tenants or prospective tenants as well. I just wonder, could you maybe elaborate on that a wee bit, Justin? The need, what do you think the department should be doing in that respect?
It's probably something that Housing Rights touched on earlier. I mean, I think similar to them, we would support landlord licensing as well. That's something that isn't in this bill, and I think licensing is a framework for a much more formal way that you would exchange information and set requirements around management standards and things like that. I mean, inevitably, whenever we call for private landlord licensing, there can be a bit of kickback that it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's too onerous. But what we always say is that licensing can be whatever you want it to be, at whatever standard you like. Really, I mean, the HMO licensing is essentially around the fit and proper person test, which is pretty introductory level when it comes to onerous requirements on landlords. So I think, for instance, for the Northern Ireland market, an all singing, all dancing licensing system like you see in some parts of GB, would probably be, more than necessary. But, there's certainly, I think, a scope there to set minimum standards some way that has an element of accreditation, and as part of that, some kind of training requirement, a knowledge transfer, which would be a good opportunity to, help to disseminate some of this information to landlords if they have to undertake an information or a training session or something like that as part of the licensing requirements.
Thank you again. I don't think we can overstate the importance of communication. We've so many vulnerable people, in particular, living in the private rented sector, and many of whom will quite likely be kept in the dark, figuratively and even literally at times. So I think a robust communication strategy is imperative around this legislation as well. But thank you, guys.
Thank you, Justin and Heather. I'm looking around the room. There isn't anyone else to raising their hand at this moment. Justin, just to let you know, and this is not prompted, and you don't owe me a fiver or anything, but I was talking to a landlord just as part of my research at the back of this, who had undertaken your training for landlords and said it was excellent, and they thought that it should be mandatory. So that's a good push for yourselves. It might be useful actually, if not asking for the full detail, but maybe the course content of what you cover in that landlord training, if you could maybe send that into the committee, just so we have seen what that is. That'd be very helpful. But for now, I think we've got everything from you. Thank you so much for your paper. Very, very worthwhile. We know that you're always on hand. Chartered Institute of Housing is always on hand for committee members to contact. If there's any further questions that we've asked you today that you want to send in any further information, please feel free to do so. But for now, thank you very much. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Kelly.
Okay. Members, that has been a very useful session this morning, but we have come to the end of our sessions of evidence for today. I appreciate it's been an early start, and plenary is about to start in about 10 minutes' time. Anybody, any other points they want to bring up before we close off for today? No? Okay, thank you. So agenda item 5 then, the date, time and location of the next meeting. So our next meeting will be our Thursday meeting as normal, and it'll be at 9 o'clock, another early start, and back to our normal room 29. Thank you very much.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.